San Diego was once known as the methamphetamine capital of the world. How meth manufacturing changed to meth smuggling. The deadly Ebola virus reappears in parts of Africa, but San Diego researchers are working on a cure. And is the Board of Supervisors changing its political direction as we head into the next election cycle? I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, reporter Charles Clark, who covers county government for the San Diego Union-Tribune, KPBS health reporter Susan Murphy, and investigative producer Tom Jones of NBC7 San Diego. Well, it was a moniker on the flip side of America's finest city, San Diego, methamphetamine capital of the world. That meth capital label surfaced in the 1980s. Then came a significant decrease in manufacturing and use of the deadly drug here in the decades that followed. But now meth is back with a vengeance, of course. Drug enforcement agents are calling San Diego ground zero in the nation's battle with meth abuse. And let's start there, Tom. Explain how the meth crisis in the 1980s differed from the alarm being sounded now on this terrible drug that's affecting so many people and their families. Yeah, so San Diego got that label of meth capital of the world because of these makeshift labs, like home labs, you know, that kind of a thing. And these labs were across the country. But in 2005, 2006, Congress passed a law, the Combat Methamphetamine Act, that basically made it harder to get some of the chemicals, that over-the-counter chemicals that these meth labs would use. So meth labs across the country have gone down. I mean, in 2004, there were like 23,000 lab incidents nationwide. By 2017, there were only 3,000. And you're talking about we'd have explosions and fires and all sorts of things that happen in these. Right, and so the meth lab, the production here in the U.S. went down, but there's still a lot of meth coming into the country. Yeah, and that kind of explains how it went from, as you say, domestic manufacturing to this whole sense of smuggling, and that's the news story, right? Right, yeah. So the Drug Enforcement Agency, as well as Customs and Border Protection, they say that these super labs are hours away, not like hundreds of miles away in Mexico. Yeah. And they're making this meth in huge quantities and then smuggling it across the border by air. You know, we've seen incidents like them using drones, by people, coming through or in cars, hidden in tires, and then by sea as well. So it's being smuggled across in huge amounts. I mean, yeah, give us a sense of the numbers there in your story were very dramatic. So in 2013, all law enforcement agencies in San Diego County, so not just federal, but local as well, 2013, 13,000 pounds of meth. By last year, 2018, over 45,000 pounds of meth seized. Wow, it's dramatic. And just this week, I think yesterday, the Union Tribune had a story just this week. I think there was another 25 pounds that were caught in a chase on one of the roadways here. Right, exactly. I mean, we found one day where, over the course of 24 hours, nearly 400 pounds of meth was seized in different separate incidents. That's remarkable. And the nature of meth itself has changed, right? Right. So in reporting this, we got the opportunity to go to this lab in Vista. And the fact that we didn't know is that all drugs seized by federal law enforcement go in the southwestern part of the U.S., so Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, California. It all goes through this lab in Vista, and that's where it's tested for its composition, its purity. And the chemists there told us that, 5-10 years ago, meth coming through was like 80% pure. Now it's mostly all the time 99 to 100% pure. So that makes it a lot more dangerous. Deadly. So a user is going to get maybe a shot that he or she just wasn't expecting at all in terms of risk of overdose. Right, exactly. And that kind of led us to looking at deaths in San Diego County. And again, it's like every turn in this story, we just found these numbers that were startling. So the medical examiner recently put out like 21 years worth of death records. And we found from 1997 to 2018,
a 430% increase in people dying from meth. That's meth as a cause of death or a contributing condition noted in their death.
Very dramatic, and that's why they're calling it ground zero here. That's why the problem is so bad here.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
Susan?
and much of it is filled with the deadly fentanyl as well.
Right, yeah. So most of those deaths that I was just talking about from 1997 to 2018, a lot of them had fentanyl. It was combined. Same thing with like heroin. I guess they find meth and heroin combined. And some alcohol as well. So you already have this dangerous drug that's purer than ever before. Right. You combine it with these other substances, it's not good.
And so you mentioned the number of deaths here, and of course we should note for every death you have this whole family devastated,
right.
network of friends. It's many more people than simply the victim in these cases. But another metric is those entering treatment programs, right?
Right.
Your story talked about that.
Yeah, so the county back in 1996, when they were kind of figuring out how to deal with this problem here locally, they created this meth strike force. And basically it's a coalition of 70 local, federal, state agencies. And what they told us is that a third of all the people going into publicly funded treatment programs, it's for meth abuse. And yes, treatment is kind of the number one thing for those who are on the front lines of this fight. They say it comes down to treatment. It comes down to treating substance abuse like a disease, like a health problem, not just a criminal problem.
And I was getting a little ahead of myself, but that does set up a bite we have from your story at NBC7 on this. And this was from Elon Burns, substance abuse counselor, recovering addict himself. He believes the answer, as you say, is treating it as a disease. Let's hear a little of that.
There's still this thought and this idea out there that, oh, you must be a bad person. You must be a broken person. And as long as there's going to be denial of the people that have it and denial of the family around it to see it.
And that's what he's talking about. Do you know how effective treatment is? I know that relapse is a serious problem for anybody going into rehab programs.
Right. Well, that's the thing with meth. We've been focused on opioids, very much so for the past couple of years or so. But with opioid abuse, there are drugs that you can take while getting off of opioids, like methadone or Suboxone, or there's different treatments you can have. Meth doesn't have anything like that. So really it comes down to therapy, a good support system. Family support is really crucial. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the only way to really combat it.
And your story also noted that certain parts of the county, the problem is kind of worse in certain communities. Which are some of the ones that are really struggling with this problem?
So the way for us to kind of measure that was 1, deaths, but 2, arrests. And what we saw with deaths is, San Diego had the most deaths, but it's the largest
It's the biggest city in the country.
Right. So, but in La Mesa, per capita, 4 out of every 1,000 people died from a meth-related cause from 1997 to 2018.
So what are some of the ways that they're trying to combat this problem? I know security at the border seems like it's really intense, really increased. So what are some of those measures?
Well, like I was just bringing up, arrests, law enforcement's response to this has grown dramatically. We saw, there were about the number of people being arrested and charged for meth has grown by like 700% as far as prosecutions filed in federal court.
And yet the load coming across the border has soared as well. So
right, exactly. Yeah, so it's still coming through in other ways. I mean, if they're seizing that much meth coming across the border, then you can't imagine how much is actually, because it's still getting into the country, obviously.
Right. Well, it's a terrific story, and I encourage everybody to go to your website or to kpbs.org, where all our stories are posted, and take a look at it. It's terrific reporting. We'll look for follow-ups on that story. We're going to move on. Well, since last August, an outbreak of Ebola virus has killed 1,000 people in the Republic of Congo, most in the past few weeks. And that's a fraction of the 11,000 people killed by a similar outbreak in 2013. The difference could be a vaccine developed by San Diego researchers, but many questions remain and much more research needs to be done. And Susan, let's start with this disease. What is Ebola? Why is it so deadly?
So Ebola is a highly contagious disease. It starts with, the symptoms start with fever, body aches, and it leads to severe diarrhea, vomiting, and hemorrhaging. And it spreads through bodily fluids. As you mentioned, the current outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there are now, the World Health Organization reports there are 1,600 cases and 1,100 deaths. So it is surging. They are working hard to keep it contained to 2 provinces, but there's a lot of civil unrest in the region, a lot of armed militia that are attacking some of the health workers and interrupting the vaccine campaign. So the concerns are growing.
Yeah, so it makes it very difficult to get in and work with people and get data and, of course, get directly to them with the vaccine. So tell us about the scientists here and the vaccine work they're doing to combat this and other potential Ebola outbreaks.
So there's a researcher, her name is Erica Ullman-Sapphire. She's been studying this disease for many years. She's a professor at the La Jolla Institute for Immunology, and she also directs a consortium of Ebola researchers worldwide. And she is studying the effectiveness of this vaccine, basically taking samples of people who have been vaccinated, taking samples of people who have come into contact with Ebola, and figuring out kind of the molecules, the molecular structure of the virus, where to target a vaccine, and how people are building up natural antibodies to fight the disease.
In dealing with the survivors, who are really the key elements of figuring out the vaccine side of it, right?
Right, and so there have been 100,000 people in the region who have been vaccinated, and of those people who have been vaccinated, they know that 15 people have contracted the virus. So they're trying to figure out the effectiveness. So out of the 100,000 people, how many people were exposed? Were 20
That's
people
the missing
exposed,
number, right? Yeah.
Or were there,
Right.
And how are they going to get that data?
So that's kind of the work in progress right now. Yeah. They're studying the samples. They have teams that fly in to collect the samples. They bring them back. They're studying. They're using high resolution images to map out the virus.
Well, and that does bring us to a soundbite from your interview here, and I'll let you set that up. What exactly is a researcher talking about here?
So Erica Ullman-Sapphire is talking about how they're studying this virus using these high resolution images, and she kind of relates it to military intelligence photos. And here she is.
All right, let's hear that.
We take these high-resolution photographs to figure out how does the virus infect? Where is it vulnerable? Where can we target a therapeutic? Or how do we design a vaccine that's going to beautifully mimic this virus and give a person immunity before they get exposed?
And they're only talking so far about one strain of this deadly virus, right? There are other strains.
So this strain is called the Zaire kind of Ebola. And it surfaced, if you'll recall, in 2013 when the last deadly outbreak occurred in Africa. They believe it started with patient 0 was an 18-month-old baby who contracted the virus from a bat, according to the Centers for Disease Control. So there are at least 5 other strains of Ebola quietly circulating in the region. Some are found in pigs, other primates, insects, and such. So they just don't know which strain could evolve next. Erica Ullman-Sapphire says they all have pandemic potential. And so while they have a vaccine that could be effective against this Zaire kind that's currently circulating, there is nothing right now to defend against any of these other Ebola, strains. So she's working on kind of trying to develop a universal Ebola vaccine or therapeutic that could target, a universal, all 6 or more of the Ebola virus.
Right. Charles?
So I'm curious, have we seen Ebola expand beyond the African continent at all? I mean, as far as the different strands?
So there are concerns that it is in Africa right now. They are concerned, though, it's spreading in 2 provinces that are up against Uganda and Rwanda. It's near these very large population centers, 8 million people in the region. There's 1 million refugees. So they are trying to contain it. If you recall, in 2016, there were 11 patients who came to the United States to be treated as well. So people travel with the with the civil unrest, there's concerns are growing as far as
because people are moving all the time with
right.
with the political problems that are happening in that.
Right.
It's remarkable in such a interconnected world as we have, and with of course jet travel everywhere. And as you say, 8 million people in that region in particular, it's remarkable that we haven't seen it elsewhere.
Right, and so the difference this time is this vaccine. And so they have the strategy to make circles around each person who contracts Ebola. So the health workers, the contacts of the contacts. But they are having trouble with that as well. So they're trying to contain it, of course.
And the funding for this research, I mean, it's going to cost a lot of money to keep this program going.
Right, so government funding, a lot of fundraising and donations. And what I was going to say with the vaccines as well, the World Health Organization mentioned yesterday they're going to expand the vaccine campaign. So they're not just going to do the contacts of the contacts, but now they're going to try to vaccinate entire communities when there's a patient found in the community.
And again, the political arrest makes that difficult, but I would imagine the populations on the ground and the parents involved, they would want everybody to be vaccinated.
Yeah, there's just a lot of distrust, and it's just hard. I think yesterday there were a group of burial workers who were attacked. There were health workers that were killed this week and last. So it's a very complicated situation.
Well, short time before we have to move on, but any idea on the timetable here? When might the researchers know if this particular vaccine works and about developing vaccines for the other strains?
And so the work is in progress, and I know experts believe that it's going to be at least a year till they can knock this down. Meanwhile, there's preparedness, happening here in the United States. I was talking to Children's Hospital officials this week. They continue to have monthly drills to practice in case an Ebola patient comes to the hospital. They think that's unlikely, but it's potential. They were designated an Ebola treatment center during the last outbreak, so they continue the preparedness.
And did we not see one or two isolated cases elsewhere in the country? I'm thinking Florida, if I recall.
There were some other isolated cases, people who traveled. There was one man who traveled to Texas from Africa in 2014 to 2016. 2 healthcare workers who treated him also contracted it. That man died. The 2 health workers survived. In all, there were 11 people last time who were brought to the United States. So hopefully that won't happen this time, but they're working hard to contain it, and concerns are growing. And we'll see,
what a breakthrough that would be, that vaccine to have it for all
Absolutely.
these strains.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to move on. Well, it's been a long time coming, but the watchword now at the San Diego County Board of Supervisors is change. Times are changing with new faces on the 5-member board thanks to term limits. Change is also apparent in recent actions taken by the supervisors, and more change is on the horizon. And let's start right there, Charles, with the political news regarding next year's election, and the long grip of a Republican grip on that county board is in real jeopardy now.
It is. I mean, the fate of kind of the majority of the board is at stake the next go around. We have 3 seats that are up for election. One is almost assuredly going to flip to Democrats. The other leans Republican. And then the third is District 3, which is coastal San Diego. And the big political news was that Kristen Gaspar, the incumbent supervisor, finally announced that she's going to seek re-election. There was a lot of speculation that she may seek higher office in Congress again.
And you explain a little of the background there. She had taken a crack at that last.
She did.
Election cycle.
Yeah, she ran for what was the seat held by former Rep. Darrell Issa. She didn't make it out of the primary in that race. She continued to serve her term on supervisor. At that point, she was only about a year into her term as supervisor, which caused a bit of a stir as well. So I think there was a lot of questions about whether she would seek that seat again, given that she now has a full amount of time to mount a campaign. Also, demographically, that region actually is probably a bit more favorable than her supervisor district for someone who's running with an R next to their name.
Now, of course, we're talking about Kristen Gaspar. Why did Democrats think they could overcome her incumbent status? After all, she did beat a Democrat.
She did, but the Democrat she beat was obviously scandal-plagued.
He was, we won't revisit that. We talked about that on the show, but there was a stain there, and she was taking advantage of that, right?
Yeah, so there was that. I think the added element to it this time is when she ran, several years ago, the registration advantage for Democrats was only 2,000. Now it's 17,000. When you add to it that her tenure on the board has seen her align pretty closely with Donald Trump, who is wildly unpopular in the district. In fact, when he ran for president, he lost it to Hillary Clinton by 20-some points. So those kind of were the writing on the wall that made them think they can really take a good shot at her.
Any Democrats emerging so far who might challenge?
There are. So there are 3 thus far. Olga Diaz, who's is an Escondido city councilwoman. There's Tara Lawson-Remer, who is a former official with the Obama administration Treasury Department, and Jeff Griffith, who's a firefighter and a member of the Palomar Board of Health.
Okay, all right. Now, shift gears a little bit. Speaking of beating Republicans, Nathan Fletcher became the lone Democrat on the board this time around by beating longtime San Diego DA, establishment Republican Bonnie DeManis. Now, he campaigned on the need for change. What impact would you say Fletcher's had?
So I think immediately the big thing we've seen is there's certainly a lot more conversation going on. And obviously, action-wise, you've seen the board do things that I think were rather unimaginable even just a few years ago, between intervening on behalf of asylum seekers, community choice energy, which is something that Diane Jacob herself tried to push but couldn't even get a second on. Nathan Fletcher ended up being her backing for that. So you've seen a lot of different areas. He's also very involved with environmental health and air quality control.
And the asylum seekers is interesting because, as you touched on earlier, Kristen Gaspar had kind of been snuggling up to Donald Trump because they were joining this suit to kind of bash sanctuary cities. Yeah,
so I actually think that's one of those examples where I think most spectators, they kind of look at it as the big thing that kind of shows just how much and how dramatically the county has shifted. A few years ago, they joined kind of after the fact a lawsuit on behalf of the Trump administration against California. This year, the board, is suing Trump and his administration for ending the so-called safe release policy of connecting asylum seekers to kind of their final destination.
180.
Right. Exactly.
180. Susan, I wanted to mention the story you had today about the county budget and they're beefing up funding for the mentally ill. I wanted to get into that.
Much of the $6.1 billion proposed budget will go toward mental health. There's a $50 million increase over last year proposed for the behavioral health services, and that money would go toward creating 177 more psychiatric beds, 100 and some more staff workers to work in the mental health, some of these psychiatric, hospitals and facilities. And then it would also, increase, walk-in services, the psychiatric emergency department response teams, PERT. So, just trying to get a handle on our growing number of people who are experiencing mental crises.
Right.
A huge problem. And Charles, is this kind of move toward the progressive side of the political spectrum? Is this kind of just reflecting a change in the county and the city of San Diego, which, as you say, Democrats, the registration numbers have gone up dramatically in recent years?
I think it's a combination. I think one, obviously, the departure of 2 longtime supervisors certainly changes the dynamic when you get fresh blood in there. I think also, with 2 other supervisors who are about to be termed out, they have a lot of things they want to get done, and I think that's made them far more aggressive in going after certain things. At the end of the day, though, the board does still have a conservative bent. I think that was on display just a week or 2 ago when we had the vote on whether the county would back the police use of force bill that Assemblymember Shirley Weber is pursuing. They elected to oppose it, which I think kind of shows as much as things are changing, it's not like a total, they're by no means fully progressive.
Let's not get carried away.
Yeah.
And let's talk a little bit about Jim Desmond, the other new face, a Republican here. A little more progressive action on his part than originally thought.
Yeah, so I think, one, he was one of the board's members who voted for suing the Trump administration, which I think is something that probably surprised a lot of people. I think he certainly is fiscally conservative. He's very conscious of that. He's also a big advocate for things like opposing Sandag's new proposal that would gut some promised road projects that would have a big impact in North and East County. I don't think we can go so far as say he's overly progressive, but I think he certainly seems more flexible than his predecessor.
And Gaspar herself, do you think she might be a little more repositioning of her approach with that election coming up?
So I think that's the thing we'll all be really watching closely. I'm not sure if there's really much wiggle room, just given that she's visited the White House, she's been photographed with Trump on multiple occasions. it's really hard to backtrack on that, especially because among the Republican base, backtracking on that, at least a certain portion of the Republican base, that's going to be viewed unfavorably.
Now, if we were in the next election cycle to see the majority shift to Democrats on this board, we could really see some dramatic changes.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of the long bet that people made a few years ago when you saw voters approve term limits, is that the kind of writing was on the wall that, oh, we can actually fully flip this board. You know, Nathan Fletcher may very well just be the precursor to something much bigger.
Right. All right. Just about out of time. They've got some money to work with, though. It's budget time, and they've had a lot of funds.
They do. So it's, talked about a lot that they have $2 billion in reserves. Most of that is not immediately accessible or already allocated, but there is still money that they're tapping into. They tapped into it to build a housing trust fund.
All right. We'll see how they spend it, and we'll watch your stories going forward on that. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Charles Clark of the San Diego Union Tribune, Susan Murphy of KPBS News, and Tom Jones of NBC7 San Diego. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today, and join us again next week on the Roundtable.